Good evening, everyone. This is the special Committee of the Whole meeting for September 19th, 2017. I'd have our city clerk to call the roll, please.
Jacobson?
Here.
Finucane?
Here.
Marquardt?
Here.
Fagan?
Here.
Noriko? Here. Verbeck?
Here.
Favor?
Here.
Smith?
Here.
8 present.
Tonight, we're going to dedicate our entire evening to the TIF, tax increment financing phase-out. We will have a presentation from Jason Michnick from our staff. We will then allow the public to comment, and then City Council will have further questions or further discussion on the presentation from tonight. Again, no final decisions will be made during committees of the whole, and that is no exception this evening. I would urge any folks who would like to speak tonight to, if you haven't already, get a speaker request form in the foyer out there and fill it out, and please give it to the city clerk, who will hand it to me. With nothing else needed at this point, I'd like to turn the meeting over to our community planner, Jason Mitchell. Jason?
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Council, members of the public. We are indeed here to talk about the last years and the available funding left in our 2 tax increment financing districts. If we could get the PowerPoint queued up here so we can get started. Tonight is intended to present a lot of information. There's several questions that in policy direction the staff needs from Council. I do not believe that we are going to be able to get through all of the direction that is needed and establishing a holistic strategy in tonight's meeting, but this is a starting point for us to begin to answer some important questions in which staff will do some more research and come back with further recommendations. So the agenda for this evening is, I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about exactly what TIF is and how it works, and then I'm going to get into the revenues, expenses, and available funds that we've projected for the last 2 and 5 years, the 2 TIF districts. I'm going to talk about several different project categories, and then also a framework for analyzing investment opportunities for the city. And then we're going to get into 3 different options and a recommendation, and then we'll get into some feedback and questions from the public and council. So to start out, what exactly is tax increment financing? Tax increment financing is an economic development tool, very powerful one, that is used in specific geographic areas to help assist economically challenged properties and subsidize both public and private investment. The way it works is in order to qualify an area, there's several factors, and this is stipulated by the state of Illinois. So qualifying a TIF district is something that is through an Illinois act and not something that the city can do and change locally. So if the TIF district, the identified geographic area, it qualifies, what happens is in that base year, that first year after it's established, it looks at the assessed value of all the properties, and that creates that base value. And then over time, as development occurs and in general inflation occurs, the assessed value of those properties in that geographic district increase. And the difference between that base value and the current value, the property tax rate is applied to that, and that revenue generated from the incremental gain in assessment is that increment. So in that chart there on the right, it shows you how that works. You have the base values that stay the same through the life of the TIF district, which is typically 23 years, but can be extended by an additional 12, so up to 35 years potentially. So that increment, as time goes on, grows, and then the last years you really do have the most increment, which is what we're seeing here in our current TIF districts. There's also specific uses that TIF funds can be used for, and this is also stipulated by the state of Illinois, and those are acquisition of real property, demolition and remediation, rehabilitation or renovation of existing public or private buildings, construction of public works or improvements, some interest assistance on financing for developers, the cost of conducting studies, surveys, and plans, Professional services such as architecture, engineering, legal, and planning, as long as they're related to the TIF district and sites or projects within the TIF district. Marketing specific sites in the TIF district. Training or retraining expenses for businesses located in a TIF district, or administrative costs associated with managing a TIF district. So really the goal of TIF is when the market can't bear the cost of redevelopment or development, TIF is used to step in to fill that financial gap so the development can occur in those economically challenged areas. So the difference between what TIF can be used for and what TIF should be used for, there is a fundamental difference, and really what TIF should be used for is increasing the tax base. The goal is to look at those economically challenged areas and be able to create investment opportunities, increase the valuation of the properties in that district so that in the long run, all taxing bodies are going to benefit from the increase of the valuation. So other traditional uses of TIF are reducing blight, which is one of the key factors for qualifying, is that there must be blight present. Supporting development in economically challenged areas, as I mentioned. Expanding the tax base for all taxing bodies, which really means that the city, because they're the administrators of a TIF district, really do have a burden of properly investing TIF funds for the benefit of the entire community. So it's also used to drive population and employment to areas for the sustainability of a local economy. Engage in transformative projects that are not traditionally invested in by the private sector, but have a net positive benefit for the community. And also funding public improvements that support further private investment or improve neighborhood property values. Next, we're going to get into the projected revenues and expenses that we have for the remaining years of the TIF. So looking at the revenue side first, I used two different methodologies to predict what our revenues are going to be for the two different TIF districts. So there on the bottom, you have TIF number 2, and on the top you have the central area TIF district. The first methodology that I use is something called linear regression, which looks at the relationship between two variables, in this case being time and property tax revenue into the TIF funds. And as you can see, in the first part of the TIF life really kind of finds goes along a linear trajectory of growth. But following 2005, you see a significant increase in TIF revenues and then subsequent years of negative increase. And then that trend line, that straight linear line that bisects that, so that's the projection that was used. So if you can see the gray line and then the green line on the graph here, those are parallel to that trend line. So that was used for the higher projection. Because you have such a drastic difference in kind of the growth pattern in the first half of the TIF and then the second half of the TIF, I used a different methodology for the lower assumption. What I did is I looked at the annual year-over-year change in revenues from 2006 to the most recent years, and that was more of a flat. So it was somewhere under 1% for the TIF districts year over year, looking into the future. For the expenditure assumptions, I looked at FY18 through 22. So I did assume that the current budget and changes that have been approved through FY17 would stay the same. So these projections are just 18 through 22. And broke those down into specific categories. So you have total estimated contractual services. These are things like the architectural, engineering, legal, and marketing expenses that are budgeted for on an annual basis, which is about $765,000 through 2022. However, I should note that though I used budget amounts from the past several years, we traditionally haven't spent that total amount. So, for example, the most recent year was about 30% of the total contractual services that was spent. The next category is committed expenses. So that first one is a contractual obligation with the target distribution center for the remaining years of their property tax abatement, so about $250,000. And then also Cornerstone and Plaza DeKalb, which were approved this last year. Those phase 2 incentives are, we estimate will hit next year in fiscal year 18, so that's $2.45 million. And then also we have debt service, which is from a 2010 bond issue, which is a little over $4.7 million. And then also the largest expense that we have in the TIF districts is the surplus distribution. So in 2008, when we extended the central area TIF district, we came to an agreement with the other taxing bodies that 1/2 of our annual revenues would be declared surplus. A portion of that is kicked back to the city and also the state, because when this TIF district was established, it was established as a sales tax TIF district. That program was ended a couple years into it, and the amount of sales tax that went into the TIF is used as to calculate the total surplus distribution. So we do get some sales tax, or it's really property tax, but it's calculated based on sales tax, back to the city. And then the remainder of that goes to the county and then is distributed at a pro rata share to the remaining taxing bodies. And then the estimated discretionary expenses, this last category. So these are things that we currently have been funding annually or approved, but are technically discretionary. So we have the 5th Street streetscape at $500,000. Annually, we provide $100,000 to the Barb City Manor and the Egyptian Theater for capital improvements, so a total of $700,000 between the two of them. And then $3.5 million, we do currently have a financial policy that $500,000 in each TIF district goes towards road maintenance. So looking at the TIF 2 last 2 remaining years, and then the remaining for central area TIF, that's $3.5 million. And then for general fund transfers, I looked at what we had used for the last several years and carried those forward. So there's no assumed change in the general fund transfers. That's estimated at just over $3.6 million. So to put all that together, what does that really mean? This is the annual revenues and expenses, and then projected balances at the end of the fiscal year periods. You will note that that last column there on the right does indicate a transfer from TIF 2 into the central area TIF district. That's a recommendation at this current time, that we would transfer the remaining funds, or up to $9 million, out of TIF 2 pending any significant opportunities coming up in TIF 2 prior to that. And that's given the momentum that we have in the downtown and the focus from the strategic plan to concentrate on the downtown. So the total remaining estimation that we have for funds that could be spent directly towards projects or programs is between $11.6 million and roughly $13.5 million. So next we'll get into the project categories. This is kind of how we broke down and looked at individual projects and opportunities. The first of these categories is subsidized private projects. So these are leveraging private development with the use of TIF funds in the form of incentives. Examples of this would be Cornerstone, Sundog, and Plaza DeKalb, which were all approved this year. So this is TIF dollars somewhere between 30 and 40% has been these three projects range, but its ability to leverage additional investment. So the total investment from those 3 projects is right around $15 million if you include TIF. The second category is public facility and infrastructure. So this would be renovation or new construction of public facilities or infrastructure. Examples of this would be a city hall, to either renovations, relocation, or new construction, and then also another example would be airport facility improvements. Third category, civic space and foot traffic drivers. These are specific types of projects where they're intended to be public meeting spaces or tourist destinations. They don't have the same type of revenue generation or direct economic impact. It's really secondary, so it's really the support of local businesses surrounding those types of attractions and really drawing people to the downtown. So an example of that would be the Egyptian Theater, STEAM Learning Center, or Library Square, which was presented in the city's 2013 downtown plan. Fourth category is blight removal. As I mentioned, this is a common use of TIF. Blight has an impact on property values, surrounding property values, so the removal of blight can have a positive economic impact. An example of this is the demolition or remediation of dilapidated properties, similar to autos, or another one potentially would be the General Electric facility over on Peace Road. The last category is new and ongoing programs. These would be programs tied to specific types of projects, so rather than looking at individual projects, we can try to categorize things programmatically. So an existing example of a program would be the Architectural Improvement Program, which is facade grants, and the second one would be a rooming house deconversion, which is a recommended program that came out of our TIF board meetings last year. and also the Elwood plan that was done, I believe, in 2011. So based on those categories, the estimate that we came up with, our current estimate, I should say, is approximately 61 million, and that's just currently based on conversations that we've had, projects that have been discussed in past planning meetings, or we've had actual conversations with property owners or developers on specific properties. So as you can see, we have significantly more opportunities for TIF contribution than we do available funding. And I think it's important to look at, depending on the type of category that we invest into, the potential for the total investment. So looking at a range between the 25 and 30% where we currently are with our incentives on private development, so that median range 27.5. If you were to imply that median across the remainder of the TIF funds, so median of the two projections, which is about 12.5 million, it would leverage about 58 million in total investments. So that's the private and the public investment through TIF. Assuming that there would be some fundraising with some civic projects, if there was a 50-50 cost sharing on civic projects compared to the private, that'd be 25 million. And then on public projects that don't have revenue generation or aren't typically funded by the private sector, it would be whatever the amount of that investment is, so about 12.5 million. Next, I'd like to get into kind of discussing frameworks, potential frameworks. These are just some examples that we thought of as staff, and this is really how should investment and development opportunities be analyzed, and what lens do you look at those opportunities with, and how do the opportunities that have been identified fit into the vision for the city. So again, some examples of potential frameworks would be maximizing return on investment, prioritizing TIF projects by the amount of new assessed valuation, equalized assessed valuation, and new tax that could be generated for the city and the community at large. The second framework would be minimizing future liabilities. So this would be the use of TIF funds to avoid bond issues for funding infrastructure or facilities in the future. And the last one is placemaking. You've heard me use this term quite a few times. This really goes to the idea of establishing a vision for the community and what components are in that vision, and identifying and executing on those specific components. And also identifying those projects and those amenities that are going to increase traffic to the downtown through that increase. The second part of this framework is really how should the city measure return on investment. There's several different potential performance measures that could be used for return on investment. The first one is an increase in EAV. The second, total amount of investment. So talking about the ability to leverage private investment. What is the total investment that could be used? New tax generation. This is going to go back to that maximizing returns. So what kind of new property tax and sales tax or other occupation tax that could be generated through investment of TIF dollars. This next one is a little bit different, reducing long-term liabilities. So with the issuance of bonds and taking on debt, there's a higher cost to doing those projects when you have to take on debt because there is accrued interest through the bond. And doing a comparison of what is the difference what does it do to the financial position of the city? One, through the issue of debt service, and is the long-term avoiding that accrued interest different than what could be gained through investment traditionally, new tax generation. Another way to measure it would be generally increased foot traffic to support local business. So having more people hitting that critical mass in the downtown would be something that would support local businesses. So that's kind of a chain reaction where if you hit that critical mass and you start to increase the local economy, it starts to carry away in itself and it snowballs. You can measure by the number of buildings. This is kind of a diversification of investment concepts. So how many different buildings could we improve, or properties could we improve through investing our TIF funds? And lastly, increase in lease rates, both on the residential and the commercial side. I think if you think about this in the way that development or redevelopment could pay its own way without the use of subsidy when you get to a specific value in lease rates, either on the residential or the commercial side. Do we want to try to hit that so that we no longer have to subsidize development and it can pay its own way? There are some downsides to that, given that as it increases roughly our current commercial lease rate in the downtown is somewhere between $6 and $10 a square foot, depending on the property. If we wanted to get to $20, our current tenants in the downtown are going to be able to afford those new lease rates? Are we essentially kicking out businesses and residents from their current living situations or where they occupy their businesses? So we're going to discuss our options next. I'm going to hit on all three of these three options and then get into them in a little bit more detail. So option A would be to prioritize the remaining funds using the current projections. So this is that $11.6 to $13.5 million. So no change in any financial policies in beginning to assess our opportunities and prioritize projects based on those figures. Option B would be to look at changes to current financial policies that could lead to increases in available funds through those policy changes. And then option C is to investigate the creation of a new downtown TIF district. So option A, prioritizing projects under the current available funds. So again, like I said, this is making no changes to the current financial policies. Our idea and the process this would work, if this would be what council directed us to do, would be you would provide direction on a preferred framework for how we analyze opportunities, and we would come back to you at a later date with specific investment portfolios that fit that criteria for those guidelines. Questions that would have to be answered with option A: can the city achieve desired outcomes with the available funding? Is the same framework used for identifying investment opportunities if you aren't going to change any financial policies and we truly do have the $11.6 to $13.5 million available? And does the way that we prioritize projects, does that change given this figure that we have available? Option B would be to look at financial policies and see if there's changes that could be made to increase the available funds. We would ultimately still have to prioritize, but does the prioritization change based on that? So the city would evaluate reducing TIF dependencies for basic road maintenance and non-core general fund transfers. Council would need to implement corresponding revenue increases to continue the basic services if we are to reduce the general fund transfers. And we would have to develop those strategies either way, because if the TIF districts do expire in 2019 and 22, that funding transfer to the general fund is going to go away either way. So the council could provide desired frameworks based on the expanded funds, which is estimated depending on which ones we're directed to look at: road maintenance, general fund, or both, somewhere between 15.6 and 21 million, depending on the adopted financial policies. Following that direction, staff again would return to council with investment portfolios that fit the guidelines and the framework that was established and directed. Questions that need to be asked in regards to option B: again, should the city reduce annual reoccurring expenses? So as I mentioned at the beginning, those contractual services, those were budgeted figures. So just to generally increase by up to about $500,000, we could reduce our annual budgeted amounts for those contractual services. As I mentioned, from year to year, those typically are not met at 100%. We also have to discuss the road maintenance. This fits directly into the CIP plan that was discussed recently by Public Works Director, and an alternate revenue source for road maintenance. And again, this would increase the available funds by up to $3.5 million. And then the general fund subsidy from TIF. So increase available funds up to 3.6, and this can happen a couple of different ways. It could be up to, but it doesn't have to necessarily hit that 3.6. The way that I calculated the general fund transfers, it wasn't just direct transfers that I calculated. I did also look at the surplus distribution. So as I mentioned, the city gets it's a total of about $500,000 additional through the surplus distribution. So $250,000 through the property tax that goes to the county and then comes back to the city, and then another roughly $250,000 that's calculated based on that sales tax figure. So the total potential, if you were to include all of that, would be between 19 and 21 million that we would have in available funds. And then the question must be asked: could the city achieve a desired vision with this amount? Before we get into question C, I really wanted to ask, are options A or B enough? Based on the city's 2025 strategic plan goals and recent discussions, $21 million may not be enough to achieve the desired outcomes in our strategic plan. A need for City Hall improvements to relocation, depending on the concept and what is chosen, could consume quite a bit of the available funding, if not most of it, depending on which option is chosen. And then also, the current assessed values for the downtown properties are less than the TIF-based values. Through both Cornerstone and Plaza, I brought up that we identified specific properties where the values are worth less now than they were 30 years ago. So I did some research and I went back in and I looked at all the properties in our TIF district, and I looked at which ones are currently valued less than they were in the base year, and then also which ones are our top increment generators. So this map is, this is in our whole TIF district. This is just the downtown. Purple is the commercial properties that are currently valued, or assessed value is less than it was 30 years ago. There's a lot of purple in our downtown, as you can see. It's quite a bit of continuity right there in the downtown core. Red is residential, and then green is our largest increments. It's cut off in this map, but a lot of the increment generated in the central area TIF district was done, is from Sycamore Road projects. Many of them were subsidized through the use of TIF, and those are our largest contributors to property tax and sales tax. So option C, creating a new TIF district. Thought here is that by creating a new downtown TIF district and giving us another 23 years of TIF in the downtown, it would expand the potential to accomplish all those goals. And whether or not the $61 million is really what we would end up spending, or if all those projects are viable, is something that we would need to determine at a later date. But as we do more projects, more momentum is going to be gained. So there is the potential that $61 million could actually go up. We would still need to prioritize projects and develop a framework. I think the idea of going into creating a new TIF district without a vision of what we want to accomplish or how to analyze opportunities would be a mistake. So regardless of whether or not we decide to go down this road, I really do think that we still need to go through the exercise of prioritizing the current projects and opportunities that we have and developing a framework for future analyzation. If we are to exercise option C, we recommend that we act now on creating the TIF district. There's a couple reasons for that. The first being that we really want to be able to take advantage of the current low assessed valuations of projects. That essentially by recreating the downtown TIF district, we're actually lowering the base value of where it is currently. So there's so many projects in the downtown that have a negative value that we would actually be lowering the base. We also, based on the recent sales in the downtown and the redevelopment efforts that are currently underway, we do anticipate an increase in EAV. So one, we want to be able to capture that increment in the first couple of years through the increase in the EAV. But two, an increase in EAV, if we wait, also puts in jeopardy the qualifying the TIF district, because a decreasing EAV comparative to the rest of the city is actually a contributing factor. In addition to the general gain in EAV, we also want to be able to take advantage of the recent projects. So Cornerstone and Plaza, I provided some projections on how much revenue that was going to generate in property tax. That would essentially seed fund some of the increment in the early years of the TIF district. And then this last reason is that recently there has been potential changes discussed to TIF legislation, especially with new TIF districts. Two of those being the ability to put parcels that were once in a TIF district into another TIF district. So that has been discussed of the idea of re-TIFing that has been potentially could be taken away. So essentially what was previously proposed is that if a parcel was in a TIF district and that TIF district expired, you would have to wait 15 years before it could go into another TIF district. The other part is the way that the school district's state aid formula is calculated. So it was discussed as part of SB1 that that school districts would have to use the TIF EAV in a calculation for their state aid formula. Neither of those has gone forward, but in past discussions, things that have typically shown up in discussions on TIF do somehow make their way into law. Tomorrow, myself and Director Charlton will be going to the state TIF conference where there will be a legislative update, so we'll be able to provide an update after that. So what would option C, what would that process look like? The first step is staff would identify a firm for a feasibility study as soon as possible and return with a contract and a resolution to council at the earliest possibility. They would go through that process, which is typically up to 6 months for them to complete that feasibility study. And if we were to find out that it qualifies, the parcels that would be included in the new TIF district would be removed from the existing district and then subsequently placed in the new TIF district, which could be done either in the same meeting or subsequent meetings. The remaining funds could be poured into a new TIF district to seed fund the project. So if we get the new TIF district in place before the expiration of the two existing, similar to the TIF 2 transfer into the central area TIF to take advantage of the downtown momentum, we'd be able to move those funds into the new TIF district instead of to the central area TIF district. And then also we would identify those high impact projects to concentrate on at the beginning of the new TIF in order to create future increments. So based on that map that I showed earlier with the upside down properties, this is a potential start recommendation for what the new TIF district would look like. So I really did try to concentrate on encircling all those negative properties, thinking that in the future we'd be able to kind of look at those clusters and identify redevelopment opportunities. You will notice that it does jog off to the west on Lincoln Highway there between the tracks and would end right at the police station. Thought there being that with a future potential expansion to the police station that may be able to be funded through the new TIF. This next chart is the idea of front-loading projects versus pay-as-you-go, so to speak. So you have two lines here, which would be the red line is if you were to look at identifying very impactful projects and issuing bonds at the beginning of a TIF district to complete those in the first couple of years. And then the second one is if you were to take the value of that total. So this is, I looked at a 1.5 million year over year on the blue line, and then the top line is a $34.5 million upfront investment. And 2% year-over-year increase on that investment or rate of return. And you can see that over a 23-year period, the total value from doing your projects up front actually has a higher rate of return. This does not account for if you were to take the increment from the projects generated, as long as you had a rate of return above the interest rate on the bond issue that you could put back into the TIF district. If you were to do that exercise, you would actually have an exponential growth curve, more substantial than the annual contribution. And I wanted to show that, but the numbers were so large that it really couldn't visualize it very well. So questions that would have to be answered in option C. If a new TIF is created, are changes to the current financial policy still desirable? Again, with the road maintenance and the general fund transfer. Does the framework change for that's used to prioritize projects? And then lastly, should the city take on the debt to front load those projects like in the previous graph? Based on what has been presented to you so far, our recommendation as staff, it would be to pursue option C of creating a new downtown TIF. The idea here is that we return to council in October with 3 bids and a contract and resolution for a feasibility study with a consultant. We do recommend reducing the dependency on TIF for roads and general funds, but looking at how to do that and accomplish that gradually over the next 3 to 5 years as the other 2 TIF districts expire. And then in terms of a framework, we do recommend aggressively pursuing private development to leverage those additional funds and investment. Projects should be significant redevelopment or rehabilitation, similar to Cornerstone, Sundog, and Plaza. This would not be programs like painting facades or helping property owners with deferred maintenance, such as roofs. Non-revenue generating projects should be transformational. So the idea of constructing a new city hall that would last for generations to come versus Band-Aids and overlays. So continuing to Band-Aid the current city hall facility and use funds for for general short-term road maintenance. And lastly, we would want to work on developing a vision and project list for potential bond issue in 2021 when the existing 2010 bond issue is completed. And that would be, again, if City Council was to determine that is the best way forward. So as I mentioned, through all these, there would be some action where staff would go and research and come back and present some sort of investment portfolios to council. To give you an idea of what that could potentially look like, we did go through the exercise of coming up with some examples. So these figures are examples. These are just estimates, and these could change drastically depending on the research that we do. But looking at all the opportunities that we identified, there just wasn't enough time for us to do a deep dive into calculating return on investment or costs on individual projects. So this first one would be reducing liabilities and increasing foot traffic. This would involve some sort of City Hall mixed-use development, providing TIF funds for some sort of expansion at the Egyptian Theater, pursuing downtown hotel development, and then also looking at the fire station and airport improvements that were listed in the memo. Example 2 is creating a critical mass in the downtown. So continuing with private development of mixed use. Again, the downtown hotel, going to bring a lot of foot traffic in if we have a hotel in the downtown. Egyptian theaters, as we've heard time and time again, when things are going on in the Egyptian, businesses in downtown do better. And then STEAM Learning Center. And then Tier 2, if we were either able to complete all those and had remaining funds, or any of those we weren't able to complete, would be Library Square, and then City Hall standalone. Example 3, beautifying downtown. So Tier 1 would be Library Square, some sort of a civic space in the core downtown area between the library and the Egyptian Theater. Lincoln Highway streetscape or complete streets philosophy. So this project is essentially looking at Lincoln Highway between 4th and the east part of campus and investigating whether or not we could do complete streets, road diet, increasing the pedestrian walkways, beautifying the streetscape, etc. And then mixed-use development in Tier 2 being Egyptian Theater and against standalone City Hall. Last example I have here for you is what it would look like if we just chose the maximizing return on investment. So looking at potential tax generation through sales tax and occupation tax, so a downtown hotel, and then private mixed use. So the idea of leveraging private development that's going to have an increase in property tax and some commercial component that drives sales tax is going to be the type of project that's going to have the largest measurable return on investment. And then Tier 2 would be the Egyptian Theater and STEAM. Those do have significant returns on investment, but they're substantially harder to calculate because all of the true return is really secondary, and increased sales tax is difficult to calculate the direct impact. So just a reminder, I know I threw a lot at you guys in a very short period. Your 3 options: option A, prioritize projects under current available funds. The questions that I had raised for that specific option is, can the city achieve the desired outcomes with the 11.6 to 13.5 million? Is the same framework used for identifying investment opportunities under those available funds? And how does the project prioritization change? Option B is to look at changes to current financial policies to increase the available funds, and then do that prioritization, and whether or not that framework stays the same in how we prioritize that projects. And the question there is, should the city reduce its TIF dependency for road maintenance and general fund transfers? And then lastly, option C, create a new downtown TIF. And should the city still reduce its TIF dependency for road maintenance and general funds, and what types of projects should be pursued in the earliest years of a new TIF district? At this point, I would entertain any questions and encourage your feedback.
Wow, quite a presentation, Jason. Thank you. Where, when, how, we're going to have the opportunity as your city council to ask some questions and certainly have some comments to our staff and to the public. It has been the consensus of this city council recently to, before we discuss presentations, such as what Jason has done, is to solicit input from the public. So we'll move to the public comment section of the agenda, after which the city council then will have an opportunity to ask further questions and have further comment. We have 4 speakers that have signed up tonight. I would simply ask you, in the interest of brevity and interest in time, to try to limit your remarks to about 3 minutes, and I'd appreciate your doing that. If you run a little bit over 3, we're not going to do too much, but I would like you to try to keep them to about 3. The speakers this evening, made in order of when you filled their requests out. Our first speaker, everybody wants to talk about TIF phase out, is Pam Verbeek. Pam? Hi.
Hi, I'm just testing. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'm Pam Verbeek, and I'm a lifetime resident of the city of DeKalb, and I've been following all this TIF information for many years, and but I'm not looking at it with blinders on. And sometimes I think when we jump from one focus to another, we put blinders on when we only look at one thing at a time, instead of taking the whole picture into account about where we need to spend our money and where those revenues are coming from. And so that's kind of the focus of my little talk here. And if I can't quite read, I just had eye surgery a couple weeks ago, so I'm going to make an attempt at this. At the time, the tax levy discussions come up each year, but especially in the past 2 years, there was an emphasis on meeting the city's pension obligations. That's going to be an ongoing thing for years and years and years. And the net result was that both years there was an increase in our property taxes to meet those required obligations. There's also been ongoing discussions by the staff of increasing our property taxes to pay for long-term debt, capital needs, and so forth. So what we do not need right now is another TIF district, which would continue to reduce the taxes that are available to meet those pension requirements. So if not for TIF, that money is going to go back towards paying pension obligations, also then reducing the amount that the general fund will need to cover to make up the difference in what the property taxes don't cover. The city owns vacant lots downtown that were taken off the tax rolls by using TIF funds to purchase and demolish the businesses and residents on those properties. So when they can sell those lots for private development, when they can attract businesses to the empty stores on Sycamore Road in downtown, or when there are definite plans that can be presented by qualified developers, then that may be the time to consider a new TIF district, but I do not believe that new TIF district should be considered at the same time that we are terminating the current TIF districts. The $11 to $13 million that staff refers to as the potential amount available for TIF programs not yet identified should be used for those projects suggested by citizens. They had all these meetings and gathered all these ideas, and there were some very good ideas, as you know. Let's see. Okay. The projects suggested by citizens to make the city and neighborhoods more safe and inviting, and to maintain or improve aging infrastructure. This also tends to increase property values. We don't know if there will be a return on the TIF investment downtown, but we do know the value to people living in homes and areas that they can be proud of. They will stay in DeKalb. They'll tell others it's a great place to live and go to school. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Our next speaker to request time is Dan Shuey. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Mayor. How are you? I'm Dan Shuey, the president of the Egyptian Theater. And I thank you very much for an opportunity to speak to you tonight. I'll be very brief. We all know the TIF will have a major impact on the future of DeKalb, and there is a real renaissance, in my mind, going on in the downtown area, and we want to be part of it. The two Pappas projects, the Sundog IT move to downtown, with more to follow. Last week, Alex Nerad made a good report on the progress of the theater, so I won't rehash that today, but I think if you've been paying attention, we really are making an effort in many areas to do some new and creative things, and we will continue to do that. The Egyptian Theater is a driving force in DeKalb economically, socially, and culturally. An example, tonight I think we have the Tim Burton movie. Tomorrow there's a Green Lens movie. And then this weekend there will be a show, and I forget who that will be. But lots of things going on there. The study included in the Barlow report identified the current annual economic impact of the Egyptian Theater at $2 million based on the current programming and configuration of the physical structure. Actually, it showed a range of 1.3 to 2.7, so if we average those, that gives us $2 million. And that's a return of roughly 20 to 1 on the city's investment in the capital improvements over the years. Our intent is to grow this financial impact very significantly in the future. Our vision is to modify the Egyptian Theater to be fully able to accommodate a full house. Nothing more grandiose than that. Extra side theaters and other projects are really not in the picture. We want to be able to take good care of the 1,400 seats that are currently available. We would like to request a place marker position for the TIF funds while we finalize our plans. The question was asked of Alex last week, and I'm not really any more prepared to answer it today. We hope to have a firm answer as to what we expect and what options will be, certainly by the end of the year, and hopefully sooner than that. We're working diligently to do that. We would welcome the opportunity for a committee of the whole exclusively dealing with the theater, as was possibly suggested by Mayor Smith. And that's really where we are. So I didn't really see the numbers of the $2 to $3 million that were in Jason's numbers a minute ago, but it's that seems like a reasonable ballpark for what we may be looking at, but it's a little too early to tell. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Next up is Paul Castle. Paul?
Good evening, I'm Paul Castle. I'm the Dean of the College of Visual and Performing Arts at NIU. I'm here as both a representative of the university as well as a member of the Egyptian Board. Today I walked with Mayor Smith on the 4th Annual Diversity Walk on campus of NIU and into town. A word on several of the people's lips was communiversity. I'm not really a fan of those kind of smushed together words sometimes, but I think it captures the essence of what this relationship between our two institutions are all about. It's obviously key success for both of us. Forward, together, forward. You may have heard that before. A central element in the success is ensuring and maintaining an excellent quality of life. And there can be no doubt that the arts play a big role in that. That's why I'm on the PET, because I see it as an asset that can be leveraged to help both the city and university succeed. That's why the college held its first ever convocation at the Egyptian, bringing in over 600 students one night to the theater and to town to celebrate their work. That's why we're eager to partner with the city to create visual enhancements such as murals at Gordon Hardware and an installation artwork at the Peace Road exit off 88, and make a true arts corridor. That's why we're working with First National Bank to have artists and performers place along the route of the Cornfest 10K run, something that Tim Struthers and I have been talking about recently. We're excited to invest our time, talent, and treasure to provide students and the city of DeKalb with an excellent quality of life. The CPA vision, you should go to our website, it's getting better every day. Our college vision is a college that's engaged, inclusive, boundless, and strong. And I urge the council to envision with the college and the university a relationship that will benefit us both for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Next up is Cohen Barnes. Hi, Cohen.
Good evening, Mayor. Good evening, Council. Been around DeKalb since 1978. I'd like to consider myself almost lifelong. Obviously, those that know me, I'm a diehard DeKalb guy. Really want to see the success of our community. But I'm also a downtown property owner at this point with the Sundog building, as you all know. I just wanted to come tonight and express, I just want to see us keep the momentum going. We have done a great job, and when you look at what's been the transformation that's happening downtown, it's substantial. There's an energy, there's a buzz, there's excitement. I bet every day I give a tour of my building to someone that wanted to see it or just stopped me on the street and said, hey, can I come and see your building, kind of thing. And I'm only in mid-construction. So that energy and excitement is something I just want to see us keep moving forward, and TIF is going to be the catalyst to keep that effort moving forward. For me, if I was sitting up there just looking at the funds that are remaining, I just got privy to Jason's presentation, so it's opened up more ideas for me, for sure. But that consolidation of the funds geographically, to me, is critical. You want to make the biggest splash with the remaining dollars at TIF, we need to make sure that those funds stay within the area that we've spent the most money in so far, consolidate or concentrating on downtown for sure. And not using TIF for operations. I mean, I'd love to see better roads, I'd love to see better other things, but ultimately, long-term, if we're going to have real vision about what we want the community to look like in the future, 10, 20 years from now, and TIF is going to be the thing to help get us there, repairing some roads right now is not going to help us get there. I want to see opportunities supported with TIF dollars that support or enhance current projects. You know, John Pappas is doing a lot downtown. It's going to bring a lot of energy and a lot of excitement, a lot of people downtown DeKalb. And any projects that we can do to support that, whether it's restaurants. I mean, I travel a lot, and I was just in Omaha, and I was just in Bozeman. And when you go to those towns, the downtowns are just amazing, and restaurants are a key part of that. And I'm not talking about a bunch of college kids coming down to have a good time. Families were out there having dinner. Businesses were bringing clients down there. It was a whole just hubbub of activity that ranged the whole gambit of people. But I'd love to see restaurants, I'd love to see specialty shops, those opportunities to have like a running store, like a Dick Pond Athletics or something downtown. Gaming Goat, I think, is a perfect example of an amazing business downtown. It's unique, it's specialized. This day with Amazon, with Walmart, and all the online shopping that's available, we're going to need shops that are unique like that. And a Gaming Goat or a running store supports the people that John Pappas is going to bring downtown as well. Clothing stores, things like that. And if you get down the list then, beautification projects. We can't say enough, there's still, when you look at our downtown, whether you're coming from south of the tracks by O'Leary's, and you see O'Leary's and you see the alley in the back of my building, that whole area visually is pretty blighted. So I'd love to see any remaining funds that we can't find projects to meet those other criteria be used for beautification projects which further the enhancement of downtown. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cohen. The last person to fill out a speaker request form is Ron Naylor.
Good evening, Mayor and Council, staff, and all the public out there. I didn't plan on speaking this evening, but sitting here listening to some of these comments and discussion, I couldn't hold me back on it. So I first of all want to compliment staff for the report and preparing this phase-out report, even though it's been about 10 years in the making, I guess, or so. and particularly in the last couple of years, I've heard for the call for this phase-out report. So it's about time, but I guess it's better late than never. I also would like to compliment and concur in this public-private development, particularly in the Cornerstone development downtown, which I think is going to be a great catalyst for the downtown, as well as some of the other proposed public-private exercises down there. When you look back about 10 years or so ago, when the most recent downtown improvement program was envisioned and processed under Mayor Van Beer at that time, some of the things that are coming to fruition now is exactly what was in that plan for redevelopment, with a mixture of residential housing along with new commercial on that. So need to compliment the city on seeing that is finally materializing down there. We could certainly use a lot more of that. One of the things that I noticed in the report here that was sort of skipped over was this concept of a return on investment, and particularly on our past projects over the last 31 years. 31 years that I've been familiar with all of this. I know in the past there's been many reports in previous years as to the value of some of these projects and these investments that we've been making, not only in our own infrastructure, but in particularly in some of these private public developments. When we give $1 million here, $1 million there, whatever it is, you'd like to know, just as was explained in the report here, about taking a look at the return on investment. I think that is something that the city council would be better served if they were to have staff spend the time and some energy in that area. The reason that data is not there, I guess I would probably challenge that on these, particularly some like the Joyce Pontiac, Northland Plaza, some of the older ones as well as some of the newer ones. I would think you'd want to learn what that return on investment is on many of those projects that were utilized or that was had TIF money spent on. Also, a question for staff, and you don't have to answer it now, but maybe at the end of the meeting, is in all the charts and the financial numbers there, on the surplus distribution that is allocated in the range of $17 to $18 million, how much of that, if any, does the city receive? And if so, is any of that money in this $13 million to $14 million that's going to be available on that? I guess I didn't clearly see that in quickly reading the report there last evening and today. With regards to going forth and looking at your projects and programs, I think I could take those 5 categories and reduce them down to basically 2, come up with an option D, utilizing one or two of the points made in option A or option B. Of course, my primary concern has been always in the past in line with what I believe was the original intention from the beginning of the TIF districts, and particularly in my tenure on the city council, was infrastructure and public-private development and investment. And infrastructure being primarily within the TIF district. And at the time I was on the council, it was directed that it would go into all of the city's infrastructure within those TIF areas that were eligible for funding in the way of streets, sidewalks, your utilities, and your parking lots, particularly in the downtown, and which for many years, that was a good share of the investments on it. In the last 3 to 4 to 5 years, that has dwindled and has been somewhat stockpiled, building, I guess, a reserve here that now you do have, whatever it is, $7-9 million in TIF 2, and I don't recall what the number was in TIF 1.
Ron, you've gone over 4.5 minutes now, so if you can wrap it up.
Well, anyway, my I guess, recommendation would be to reduce it down to those 2 programs. We don't have need for, or we have a need for new programs, but I don't believe there's enough time, and particularly blighted areas are definitely an area to look at, but again, we haven't done very much in the way of blighted area over the last 31 years, and I don't believe there's enough time to start that program or any new programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Okay, now it's time for Jason to reappear, and I would suspect, Jason, that a few council and aldermen will have a few comments or questions. And who'd like to start? The lady to my left, Alderman Noriko.
Big surprise. Yeah. Thank you. And I have several questions and then some general comments. First of all, typically, in taking a look at TIF dollars, is the thinking generally that it's wiser and you get better return by targeting your dollars on several projects, kind of major projects, versus spreading out the dollars to more projects, with smaller costs attached?
I think you really have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. It really depends on the type of large projects and the type of small projects that you're going to do. If you concentrated on rehabilitation of existing buildings, one of the things that staff has talked about, especially with downtown property owners, is the use of TIF funds to bring current buildings up to code. Historic buildings are very challenged, and the cost of bringing them up to current codes is very substantial, whether it's ADA compliance with elevators or fire suppression. Those types of projects don't tend to have a very high return on investment. They will increase the viability of a property for the next couple of decades. But thinking about it really depends on what you're trying to get. If you're trying to protect the historic integrity of the community and increase the viability of individual properties, but if you're looking for maximizing future revenues, then you would want to look at really kind of concentrating on low assessed or blighted properties and redeveloping those into types of developments that are going to have large tax generation.
The Elwood Historic Area, the meeting that was held to generate ideas, from that group, I didn't necessarily see very much of that, kind of filtering through to the final recommendations, particularly with, the comments about, facade improvement and, and the group is actually thinking of, beyond that. But I guess my question then is, did I interpret that correctly, that, the Ward 5 Elwood Historic Area has kind of...
I think in the presentation itself, I didn't hit on that. I tried not to get into too much of the detail that was in the memo, but in the memo, it discusses specific programs that were recommended out of the Elwood Historic District. Really, I think that the two key programs that came out of that meeting were rooming house deconversions into single family, and then also general residential facades. So similar to the architectural improvement program for commercial properties, doing some sort of one-to-one match on improving the curb appeal of residential properties in the historic district.
Okay. I would suggest that as some guiding principles as we take a look at TIF dollars, because no matter what we do, we're never going to have enough money. It's, unless you can make money, there just isn't going to be enough. But that we look at public safety issues, and I'm using that in a broad sense, not in necessarily a police sense, but for example, with City Hall, I think it's really important that, city staff, residents who, come to City Hall, council, and so forth, work in a facility that is safe and encourages their productivity as opposed to complicating their productivity. Secondly, and this is hard for all of us, we need to think about the good of the whole. What is best for the city as a whole. And, I'm a resident, I'm a homeowner, I might like taking a look at, what's happening on Barb Boulevard and have some ideas, but ultimately, to the extent that we can, think about what is the greater good.
Thank you.
And that sounds very, kind of philosophical and visionary, but I think we need, some basic principles, and I really do think if we can go back to those ideas, it will help us, or at least I know it's helping me.
Thank you for your comments. As I mentioned at the beginning, I think this meeting was kind of just a starting point, and these conversations are going to kind of lead to us developing a more cohesive and comprehensive strategy, and seeing how TIF fits into that greater good. To address your comment on safety, I should have hit on it when I talked about the Lincoln Highway Complete Streets, but one of the philosophies behind that came out of the meetings that we had last February with NIU students at O'Leary's, and they had talked about the not feeling safe when they were walking home at night, and there needing to be an increase in lighting. One of the concepts of the complete streets in the streetscape on Lincoln Highway would be to provide more lighting in that connection between the downtown. That's only a small section of the city, but thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Kate. I think, and to Jason's point, this is a beginning, and we've only had Alderman Norrico speak of the folks up here so far, but I can see where this is going to go, and that is we're going to have some specific questions about specific projects, and it is going to be up to us then to decide which of the options or how we do a sort of a combination of some of the things that are up there under your option thing. So let's turn it over Alderman Fagan.
Thank you, Jason. This is a great report, and like Jerry said, we're going to talk about this a lot more. Is there any way that to form a new TIF district to extend the TIF district's time frame that we have now? And if so, would we have to reevaluate the EAV values on that?
It's a good question. So the Central Area TIF District, which is the larger of the two, was extended in 2008. There actually is legal precedent in the state of Illinois to do a second extension. There's one TIF district in the state that's done it, down in Springfield. An extension is different than a new TIF in that you don't have to go back and do the feasibility and change the base values. However, you do have to have legislation passed in Springfield in order to extend the TIFs. I think after we investigated that potential, and also through subsequent conversations with the school district and the conversations they're having with their bond structure, we don't recommend. We really do feel like the existing EAV and the two TIF districts needs to go back on the tax rolls. The way that we drew the new TIF boundary, it really encompasses properties that they're not going to get any increment in EAV from, so there really isn't any net benefit from them not having those properties or us looking at those properties specifically.
Pat, does that answer your question? Okay.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry.
Sure.
Thank you.
Alderman Fanouken?
Jason just mentioned District 428, and one of the concerns that we've heard over the years is that we're taking money away from the school district. In your opinion, and you may not have solid numbers, but do you think that through the surplus distributions and the TIF dollars that we've spent on District 428 construction projects, do you think we've made District 428 whole? Have they gotten an amount of money equal to what they might have gotten anyway? And like I said, I knew you would, and I just told you a little while ago I wouldn't give you the deer in the headlight look, but I just did, unfortunately. So, but I know you looked over there, so I'll turn my head over there too. Do you have any ideas that might be able to?
We haven't calculated an amount, but I think one of the things you can look at is a recent action of the City Council in the last year approving the intergovernmental agreement with the school district and funding $2 million in improvements in the local schools. to try to address that, trying to make the school district whole. So it's not something we've calculated, and I'm not sure if it's possible. I'd have to defer to Jason on that. I can tell you that we've had an ongoing dialogue with the school district, letting them know what we've been talking about, and we met as recently as last Friday. Director Charlton, Economic Development Planner, and myself met with the superintendent and their Director of Finance. So we've been keeping them aware of all our discussions, but we can't directly answer your question tonight.
Okay, that's fine, but at least it's out there. And then my other question was, Jason, with your proposed new TIF district, the current TIF district goes further down Lincoln Highway and includes some of the other commercial properties out there, but the proposed new one only goes to 7th Street. What was the thought process behind not going further down Lincoln Highway?
I think this is going back to the conversations that we've had with the school district. We have said that with new TIF districts, we wouldn't look at the substantial footprints that we currently have, that we would be looking at more of targeted TIFs. I think that this was really drawn based on that policy that we've stated, is that we were going to look at smaller footprints. So if we were to look at something on East Lincoln Highway, I think we would actually recommend doing a separate TIF. I think that if you start to go through that exercise, we're eventually going to get back up to about the same size that our central area TIF district currently is. I think in regards to, there's a potential strategy if we were to move towards a new downtown TIF district, depending on the amount of funds that are transferred from the existing TIF districts into the new ones. If we do leave some of the funds in the existing one, we could really concentrate the available funding in the remaining years to concentrate on those areas that are outside of the downtown or outside of the new TIF district.
All right, thank you.
Alderman Favor.
So my thoughts are, obviously to prioritize where the work's been done today, prioritize still the downtown area. And I like the strategy of basically the return on investment, where the return is the ROI, the ROI is the improvement in the EAV from where it is today to at the end of the improvement, how much did we increase the EAV in a given area? That would be my measurement. But my priority would be to continue to, look at things that would generate taxes, commercial, retail, businesses downtown, fixing things like structure, again, not deferred maintenance, but structural changes, demolishing buildings, building new buildings, getting a lot of private investment and development if we could. And then, of course, I think the airport is an important part as well, and with the amount of money that the federal government and that the state is willing to give, our match is so small that it's like such a bargain to go and make the improvements that they're willing to offer us, that I would continue to fund the airport as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Any further questions or comments?
Mayor.
Let's go over to this side again. Alderman Jacobson.
Again, looking at some of the information that's being presented to us, and I think that the last page, or I think it's the last page in our backup, shows the map of all the properties that have lost money in our TIF district. I mean, effectively, imagine being a homeowner or a business owner and buying your home 30 years ago and knowing today your home is worth less than what you paid 30 years ago. At the same time, salaries have doubled or tripled in the city of DeKalb. At the same time, pension liabilities have quintupled or more in the city of DeKalb. It's not surprising to see why a lot of homeowners, especially looking at this chart of all the residential properties that have lost value, are frustrated and are angry and feel that the city's being mismanaged. And again, I realize this is over a 30-year period. This isn't something we did today. This isn't something probably any of us anyone in this room is responsible for. So it's not to point fingers at what's happening right now, because I do see some momentum in the downtown. I do see some value in some of the TIF expenditures we've made. But the reality is, after spending $160 million, we have no ability to ascertain what our return on income is. As the document says, it's very fragmented and difficult to ascertain. And in the photo sense of looking at the map, all the properties that have lost value over 30 years, again, assuming that there is a simple inflation rate or cost of living rate, there should be no possibility those properties could possibly be worth less 30 years later, and they are. So again, I can see why there's heartburn, not just in our community, but in the state of Illinois, that TIF funds are being improperly utilized. The reality we're seeing is, at least in our community, that we don't have an accounting of those expenditures. We cannot provide an ROI. We cannot show the community why $160 million of that money was spent and how they even benefited from it. And a lot of the people that are directly affected by it, again, being either commercial business owners or residential homeowners, are seeing a loss. It would be difficult in that construct for me to say, let's go ahead and look at another TIF. I mean, the reality is, not just in our community, but in our state and further beyond our borders, they are improperly utilized time and time and time and time again. It makes it hard for me to believe that could even be a viable option going forward. In looking at what the downtown looks like specifically, and even in the redevelopment area or the current area, again, at what point, what else can we do to provide something to be a catalyst to get this downtown going? I mean, again, at $160 million of investment, we're not even to where we were 30 years ago. I don't know, now that we only have a small percentage of that money, again, probably 10 or 15%, I think it's going to be an important conversation to have of what we spend that money on. Do I believe it should go to public infrastructure? No, that's what it's gone to in the past. Do I believe it should be going to roads? Ideally, no, but unless we can find another funding source, then yes. Do I believe it should be thrown at the same projects we've thrown millions of dollars at over the last 30 years and haven't provided much of a return on investment or a demonstrable return on investment? No. Clearly, that wasn't the right path. So again, I think this is a great start of the discussion. I appreciate that we at least have some sense of what the future and current balances look like. I can imagine that we're going to have lots and lots and lots more discussion on this topic to move us anywhere forward from where we are now.
Thank you, David. Alderman Verbeek.
Again, I look forward to that discussion. I think this is of critical importance, and I've already heard some great comments and great ideas. Considering the whole city beautification, Mr. Barnes, I think some very worthy ideas. I think for myself, we're at a point, and I appreciate all the residents' comments and feedback I've received thus so far, and hope and ask for more of your direction and input as we work on this as a whole. That we have invested a lot in downtown, and I understand how we can encourage a return on that investment and why it's important, and private investment is certainly a top goal for what we're working on. But these TIF districts are large TIF districts, so Mr. Barnes' comment on beautification, well, imagine some effort on East Lincoln Highway, for example, that's within the TIF district, reducing perhaps 4 lanes to 2 lanes, and how could that benefit the city as a whole? The historic Elwood House district, lots of great meetings and discussions over the years regarding TIF, many great ideas. Love the if you continue like the Fisk Pond, Short Street, one of our first TIF efforts, look at that in the Elwood House District, renovating these rooming houses, converting them perhaps to something with the arts, related to the arts, where perhaps an owner lives there, teaches there, and has a little store all in the same place in the Elwood House Historic District. So while I certainly applaud the private investment to date, I think that we should look at a more comprehensive view at the whole TIF districts that these areas represent. We've been collecting from all of their properties through large TIF districts over the years, so what can we do to
and where we should focus our efforts in that vein, because a fair amount of the residential areas are under, and that can be attributed to all kinds of various factors. Just the fact that the housing market went down, the economy went bad, people lost jobs, they didn't maintain their homes, they lost their homes, the homes got turned over into various things. So there's a whole lot of factors that go into that. So if you're looking at just the proposed new downtown TIF, that seems to be more of a focus on the commercial slash entertainment slash cultural center of town, if you were to focus on that part. I put some backing in behind doing some funding for the Egyptian Theater, if one way or another. I think not only is it a treasure, but it is one of those places that you remember if you visit town. It focuses a lot of economic drivers downtown. The university uses it. It's a community center for the city without actually us having a community center. Part of what has to be balanced with this too is the pensions and the roads part. I think that the TIF has been used through the years for a lot of infrastructure, through Renew DeKalb and whatever the other one was. There was another organization there before that, right? Main Street, there we go. Main Street and Renew DeKalb. So there was a lot of the money was used for infrastructure, for beautification, getting rid of a couple of buildings, creating the empty lots, burying utilities, kind of doing that infrastructure and creative stuff. And right now, when we're at this point of actually changing the buildings and enacting the plans, any of the strategic plans, is right at the end of this thing. So we've gone this whole part and we've spent that money on those things. And so we're right at that point. So I can see the inkling that you would have to want to extend this so that we can take that final step forward with that. So it's kind of a debate there. Which way do you go? And if you make a couple of things and you pick out a couple of areas and you say, yeah, this is what we're going to do and this is going to be our bang for the buck, and we have to figure out our finances in another way, then there you go. The one thing I do want to say, Alderman Jacobson, and I understand that there is a perception out there that, our salaries have increased so much, I forget what you said, in the 30 years. But 30 years ago, I had a job on a farm at $3.50 an hour. The same people, if I was working that farm, my wages would be considerable more. It wouldn't, part of that increase is just increase. I understand the concern about high wages, everybody has those. But part of that is also the fact that we just get paid more than what we used to. There's been inflation over the years. You know, the 70s, whew. So, in my opinion, one of the first things we got to decide is one way or the other, if we stay and end the TIFs, or if we extend it, or if we go the other way, is to decide how we want to do it, if we want to do it residential versus commercial, or if you want to do a combination thereof. Anyways.
Mayor?
Thank you, Mike.
Mayor, could I address some of the questions that have been asked, just as a
Certainly.
point of reference for the council?
City Manager Anne Marie Gore.
Thank you very much, Mayor. First of all, there was a comment by one of the public that had talked and asked about using TIF for pension obligations. You cannot use the TIF funds for that. So you have to look at what are the particular ways of allocating the TIF funds. So I would not recommend that. I deferred to the attorney if he wants to comment any further on that. But just to address a couple of the comments and a couple of the points, you know, my recommendation, or the way I would suggest to the council, is that you cannot control past council decisions on how these TIF funds have been used. You're only looking at what information you have today and your power and authority to move forward. So you have to look forward, and you have an opportunity to build on the momentum that is taking place. All you have to do is go back to the memorandum that Economic Development Planner Jason Michnick put together on Cornerstone to see the return on investment. So if you want to see how a development such as Cornerstone is going to build and increase that increment, which was one of his first slides, you'll be able to see that. So think, if you go back in time, if it had been a policy of previous councils to invest in that private development, and if that had taken place 20, 30 years ago, the increment and the property values that might now be in the downtown. So when you look at what your decision is going forward, I'm gonna keep reinforcing this, because I had another conversation with Alderman Norrico on this. I'm always gonna say, what do you want the community to look like 20 years from now, 30 years from now? So by one of the option C of what Planner Michnick put together is looking at a new TIF, you have that opportunity to carve out an area that is not going to negatively impact the school district, because these values, for whatever reason, are either the same or lesser than they were 32 years ago. We were very concerned. This is why we've been continually meeting with the school district monthly for the past couple of years, and why we met with them on Friday before this meeting. I strongly agree with what Planner Michnick said in regards to not extending the current TIFs, because the school district is meeting, I believe tonight, looking at a bond reissuance of how they're going to restructure the bonds from the referendum to be able to not spike the property taxes for the residents and try to maintain that rate as low as possible. So they're basing that assumption on when these TIFs expire. So whatever action you take as a council, my recommendation to you is you'd want to be really cognizant of what that impact would be on the school district. Therefore, that's why if you look at a new TIF carving out that core of the downtown, doesn't have a negative impact. I would concur with Planner Michnick when you look at the timing issue of trying to capture that increment that we know we're going to get from Cornerstone and Sundog and Plaza DeKalb, and that becomes kind of the foundation moving forward. One solution to address Alderman Verbeek's comment, Alderman Marquardt's comment, you can, if you want to, as a policy moving forward, you could carve out a percentage for neighborhood stabilization or neighborhood redevelopment. So as you go forward and you decide what options you want, or what is the balance of private investment to increase that increment, you could look at and say, look, we realize that a portion of our TIF over these last number of years has been the neighborhood, the residential component. You could say, we're going to take 10%, and we're going to develop a neighborhood stabilization plan to get owners to reinvest. I know Director Charlton has had some thoughts on this, and we've talked about that at the staff level. So that's a policy decision that you can direct moving forward. I would keep in mind, too, that if you do direct that, realize we have two TIF districts that still are going to extend. One is going to 2018, and the other one is going, I'm going to look at Jason, 2021, 2022.
21 is when it expires, but the last allocation is in 22.
we get the revenue to 2022. So keep in mind, those projects, so if you're looking at the making sure you're addressing the neighborhoods, that doesn't end, that ends in the next couple of years. So you still have time. It's not necessarily tied to the creation of a new TIF. I would just say, I wish we had detailed records analysis that took place from the very start of the TIF that we could share with you, because it would make our jobs easier, that we could prove to you either the return on investment or not prove to you the return on investment. We just don't have that data, unfortunately. I would say this, you had, a couple weeks ago, Public Works Director Holdeman made the presentation on the asset management plan. And that is going to be discussed further by the council. We're going to look at direction of how you want to proceed with that. To be really blunt, we have a structural imbalance on capital spending is directly related to the city's dependence on TIF for infrastructure. If a decision had been made 20, 30 years ago as far as how to fund streets outside of TIF, and maybe there were some of those decisions and maybe something just changed in that time period I'm not aware of, we wouldn't have some of these issues. If there was a policy decision saying that the priority is to go into the private investment to increase that increment, but the reality is that the previous policy decision has been to use that on public infrastructure. So we haven't seen then that increment, we haven't seen those property values. So it is not directly related to, let's say, mismanagement. It could just be directly related to a policy decision of how you wanted to use those TIF funds. So I think you have a lot of directions you can go in. So if you want to carve out and create a neighborhood revitalization or stabilization program or whatever you want to call it, you can do that. You can say, we want to take X dollars, X percent, however you want to carve it. If you want to say we want to focus on the great projects that we have going and see that, encourage that private redevelopment, we can go in that direction as well. So we're really, our goal is to have the first discussion with you tonight. I know the other goal is to see what your perspective is on option C and whether you would encourage us to proceed forward to be able to bring more information back to you or answer questions that you may have in regards to new TIF because of the timeliness that Director Michnick pointed out. And with that, I would answer any questions.
And we may have a better handle on that tomorrow when you attend this conference to find out what the state update on TIF.
Absolutely. I think that's only one of the issues with the timing of creating a new TIF. I still think you need to take into consideration the advantages of if we're able to get ordinance approving a new TIF district in place before the next assessment to be able to take advantage of the current low EAVs and the projected increases that we would see in the first year or two. I'd also like to comment on a couple of things that the city manager mentioned, one being in regards to the pension. When these TIF districts expire, that EAV, that incremental EAV is going to go back to the tax rolls, and the city does have the opportunity when that happens to levy against that EAV going back onto the tax rolls for pensions. So looking at the designated or potential new TIF based on trying to encompass those low EAVs that are upside down, there's not really that same net gain by including those in a new TIF. It doesn't impact necessarily the ability to levy for the pensions in the future. And then also to comment on Alderman Jacobson's, I know we don't have detailed records and the ability to calculate return on investment from past expenditures, but if you really look at some of the private developments that were subsidized, a lot of them in the past were on Sycamore Road. And I think if you look at the timing when that occurred, that was a trend that was occurring nationally. I think a lot of downtowns kind of fell by the wayside as national retailers and big box development was going out onto that main strip. There's a lot of communities that made that same mistake, and now that you have the Amazons of the world are having such a large impact on big box retails, there's a sudden shift back to downtowns because it's the true identity and character of a community. But also it provides you the opportunity to have more of an experiential shopping, you have the dinner, you shop, you go to dinner, you go to a show, and you have that clustered in the same thing. It's not like a big box retail where you have to drive out, park your car, go into a store, come back out, drive to another store.
realizing that we are at the starting blocks, if you will, of this discussion, are there any further comments? Alderman Jacobson.
I would imagine somewhere we have a list of expenditures of all the TIF accounts, correct? I mean, I'm trying to figure out what the easiest way to get some additional data would be. Obviously, the return on ROI and things are going to be difficult to find. But being that it's segregated in one account, I'd imagine we have an entire list of all the expenditures that have come out of TIF, correct?
Yeah, it's just, if you go back to, one, the reporting standards for TIF changed in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it became substantially easier because of the state's requirements. We could go back, but a lot of those records aren't available readily. It's going back into the archives and digging through budget documents and then having to make sure that what was in the budget was actually what was spent. So it certainly could be done. It's going to be very time consuming in order to do that. But if that's the direction of council, that's going to just note that it's going to take a substantial amount of staff time to do that.
It's in a segregated account, is it not? All of our
Yeah,
TIF
we have-
funds are
we
in
have
a
two,
TIF fund.
yes.
So then wherever that account is, we have to have a ledger from that account that's a running ledger, correct?
Yes. So when I inquired of that from the finance department, it was not that simple.
I think
is what I was told.
the challenge that occurs if you look at our current budget and you look at the detail when you get down to line item, the detail we have in our current budget is more than the city had in their budget at the line item level 10 years ago. It's far more than they had 20 years ago. In terms of finding the annual budgets, as Planner Michnick said, those are things that are easy to track down to determine what was actually spent out of the TIF fund on a given project and allocate, this much was spent on bricks and mortar for this project versus this much was spent on the city's TIF consultant in 1987, or this much was spent on marketing or whatever other different things were undertaken. It's not just finding the ledger, it's finding the actual expenditures and confirming what the individual expenditures were spent on. We haven't gone back and located all of those records. I don't know candidly to what extent the city has all of those records. If it's a matter of identifying the total amount that was spent, that's relatively easy. It's getting down to the detail of what specific projects it was spent on. And it's a very awkward position for us to be in to say it's challenging to reconstruct what this significant amount of money was spent on just a couple decades ago. But the records from that time are simply not good records. We don't have good indication of what they were spent on. The city's current policies, the city's current practices, the way we document projects now, the justification at the start of a project, and the documentation we do on requiring documentation from a project owner when they're receiving any kind of economic incentive from the city, whether it be TIF or otherwise, is far greater over the past 5 years than it was over any previous time. And we can document to the penny what literally every penny has been spent on any project that has received an incentive from the city, TIF or otherwise. We apologize for the condition of the records of the past. We can go back and try and reconstruct what's there. And if that's, as Planner Michnick said, if that's the direction of council, that's what we'll do. But it will not be the fulfilling experience that council's looking for. And there will be a lot of gaps in that information that will make it very difficult to say this specific number of dollars was spent on this project, and you can see how that translated or didn't translate into an increase in sales tax, which we don't have sales tax records for all the businesses in the community that received incentives over the past 30 years, or how it translated into property taxes, which those we could go back and get from county records. We simply don't have much of the information, and that which we do have, historic city records have not been maintained or categorized or cataloged in a fashion that makes them readily accessible. And that's a continuing frustration for the council and for the public, and we will follow whatever direction the council has in terms of trying to garner what's there and present it to you.
Alderman Noriko.
While I recognize the value of having a clear understanding of TIF expenditures, at this point, it doesn't appear to me that the return on investment for the amount of time city staff would spend on producing what has been acknowledged to be an incomplete product, it doesn't make sense. We wouldn't even be comparing apples and apples. We'd be comparing apples and rotten apples or rotten oranges or something. I mean, I think city staff time could be better spent on helping the council make a decision on how to use TIF dollars going forward and really helping us develop a plan for how to spend these TIF dollars.
Thank you. Alderman Verbeek.
Yeah, just to follow up to city manager's response to the comment, I think the comment I heard was not to use TIF for pensions, but to look at pensions before further engaging TIF. And that's what I would support as well, is that I like the idea of a project-based TIF. I think that's a strong idea. But I think before we consider any of that is Moody's has told us very recently and dropped our credit rating very recently to say that not only, of course, our state is challenged, but us as a municipality is challenged to maintain our pension obligations. So I believe once we would hardline what we will require to contribute for pensions, Moody's will recognize that. Perhaps our credit rating will go up. Then perhaps maybe it's a responsible time to take on debt or leverage TIF dollars for debt. But let's try to restore that advantage, that credit rating we once had, to be able to utilize money at an effective rate for our taxpayers. Also, I guess I'm going to ask, see Mr. Conlon in the audience for the help from the Finance Advisory Committee. I think that their discussion and evaluation of our options, and option A is one. Parts of option A I can support, but I would like to hear more from them. Perhaps that could include more information about what are the general fund transfers. So we have $3.6 million scheduled for the remainder of the TIF. What are those general fund expenditures or transfers? What do those represent? May we find efficiencies in those? May we use some of those dollars for projects instead? But yes, I'm willing to take the meetings necessary to get to that solution.
Thank you. Alderman Fagan.
Real quick, getting back to the records, are we in line now on going back to how many years and finding out our expenditures and what they went for? I mean, are we in line now? Because you're apologizing how bad the records are now, or they were. Are we in line now? And how far back are we in line?
Yes, the city currently complies with all legal requirements separately. We go above and beyond in terms of what we require for project documentation. And I can't tell you exactly how far back that goes. I know that going back at least 5 years, we have good records of every penny we spent on economic development projects that the city incentivized. And I can point you back to specific conversations with Jason's predecessor where we started identifying some of the deficiencies and looked at ways of changing them and implemented a manual that every economic development incentive project we meet with the applicant and go through exactly what the documentation requirements are. So we're getting down to levels of detail of copies of invoices, ensuring that we have prevailing wage records where required, lien waivers on larger projects. We're processing payments through a title company to ensure that every single penny is tracked. I have a very high degree of confidence in our record keeping at present, yes.
I just want to make sure.
And I would just add that in addition to just what Attorney Frieders talked about, that we have put procedures in place across the organization. We have been putting more and more documents online, whether it's ordinances and resolutions, trying to go back in time. So we have had staff members solely dedicated to going through our, if you want to say, our hard copy files to make sure that the files are correctly documented or all the information is in the correct files. And then over time, one of our goals is records management, is really trying to get more and more of what those hard copy files are scanned electronically. And we've looked at that, and this is a project that we'd like to do moving forward, because the more of these records we can get scanned, we can put on the website and make it easier for the public to access and be more transparent. But it takes a lot of time playing catch up. But we're going backwards in time, but we've also created a process moving forward that every new document is being categorized correctly.
Just want to make sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Alderman Jacobson.
The ask to try to understand the finances over the course of a 30-year, $160 million project. I understand that at this point, there's not a whole lot we can do but move forward. But the first question you have in moving forward is, what's worked? And without any information of what's worked and what's haven't, after spending $140 million to pretend that you're magically going to come up with the answer for the last 20, I think is foolish, is silly. Again, we have no idea what's worked, what investments have made sense. We have no idea, did it make more sense to do infrastructure or private property or commercial property? We have no data. We have zero understanding, not only of where that $140 million went, and some of it in the more recent years, of course, is trackable, but what projects made sense, what projects had some value, so that when we're planning in the future, you understand where your best bang for the buck is, and it's not just guesses. It was guesses then because they had no data, and it's guesses now. At the end of the day, no matter what expert you bring in, no matter what financial wizard you bring in, it's a gamble. That's what it comes down to in terms of projecting what your ROI will be. So that's a bit frustrating to hear that we don't have any of that data to rely on. In terms of the property tax question and the pension question, I think it would be unfair to characterize TIF as not providing support to pensions. It does. The goal of TIF is to increase EAV, which increases the property tax, which in our schism goes 100% to pensions. So to claim that they aren't associated or related, I think is unfair, because in some weird second cousin sort of way, they certainly are related and probably directly correlated. I look forward to the discussion. It's gonna be an interesting one, and I would agree with Alderman Verbeek that I think some of this, at least in the preliminary time, has to be tasked to the FAC to try to have them muddle through what our best guess will look like, and that's where we're at this point, I guess.
Mayor, can I address the questions or points in regards to
Sure.
The property tax and pension? So I interpreted one of the speakers of talking about allocating TIF towards the pension obligations, and if that was not the point, that is how I understood it. When you look at right now what the financial policy that the council has previously adopted of how to fund pensions, it's kind of like, or how to utilize property taxes, I guess is a better way to put it. It's viewed as a foundation of moving up. At the bare minimum is looking at police and fire pension, Social Security, IMRF. Then you end up looking at, beyond that, perhaps police and fire, perhaps then above that, all services. We are not even at the foundational level, because the foundational level says that the city will utilize property taxes to pay for all pension obligations. So that's the police pension fund, the fire pension fund, Social Security, and IMRF. And IMRF, for those in the audience, stands for the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund. So as of the last couple years, we have only been taking property taxes to fund the police and fire pension fund. So we're not fully allocating towards all the city's pension obligations. The thing to keep in mind is one of the things Moody said, and Moody's is concerned about, is our over-reliance on sales tax, and the fact that in comparison to other municipalities, we are not utilizing property taxes to fund pensions. They view property taxes as a stable funding source, and they're more comfortable with municipalities using that as a funding source. 2 nights from now, Thursday night, in this very room, 5 o'clock, for those interested in coming, is the Finance Advisory Committee meeting. On that agenda, the very first thing is the actuarial studies regarding the police and fire pension funds. The FAC will be discussing how much is being recommended to allocate towards the police pension fund and to the fire pension fund. And they will discuss that. They're going to look at, do you change any of the assumptions as to the funding rates, and then what does that do to the allocation? But if the city council is concerned about future ratings of how Moody's is going to view this, they're looking at how much do you allocate of the property tax to pay for the pensions. And quite frankly, the pensions are going to keep going up. We've seen that track record over the last couple of years. They're going to keep trending up. It's not a question of if, it's a question of how much. The other thing I would, to specifically address Alderman Verbeek's point as far as bonding, it was very evident during the asset management plan presentation and having Ellers present and the analysis that they did for us in looking and actually talking to Moody's as well, is not recommending going out for bonds probably prior to 2020. I think we're in about a 2-year horizon right now. I think Planner Michnick was talking about 2021. We could do it. It's just the question of how much that costs us to borrow. But I think from a strategic standpoint, we want to try to defer any other bond issuance. I think what Planner Michnick was trying to do is tie it into the retirement of bond issuance. I think it was 2010A. So just something to keep in mind as the council looks at whether it's how we're going to fund streets or fleet, or how you're going to fund TIF. But there are some challenges that we have as far as how to fund infrastructure, how to fund operations, that aren't going to go away.
Yes. Joe Ellen, did you have a comment?
I did, thank you. I just wanted to follow up on some of the comments made by Alderman Jacobson in trying to look at historical data to see what types of projects might determine the success of the TIF district. And really, I want to emphasize that it's really important to look at a mix of types of projects in determining the success of a TIF district. I say this because we have traditionally spent a lot of money in our downtown on infrastructure and things that have somewhat beautified the area. And yet, we look at a map at the end of the TIF district and see many of the properties upside down. So while we've made those investments in infrastructure, we haven't seen the return on investment by increasing the EAVs in the area. On the other hand, if we would have done total private development in the downtown, we may have had many new successful projects that added to the EAV, but those projects may not be successful if they're not supported by adequate infrastructure or supported by projects that are bringing people to the downtown, like a city hall that might be relocated that's bringing court traffic and people that do business at City Hall and having business meetings, or the Egyptian Theater or a STEAM type of project, which are intended to draw foot traffic to the downtown. So I kind of go back to the focus of I don't know what benefit we would gain by evaluating individual types of projects in looking at all of that historical data, because it's really the combination of all different types of projects. So the infrastructure projects, the foot traffic generators, the private investment. It's really a very fine orchestration of putting all of those together to make a successful downtown. And I think Alderman Marquardt, you started going down that path and saying we've done all the infrastructure, we've done some of these cool projects beautifying, and now we just started on some of the private investment, and kind of we need to finish that part of it now. And we're at the end of our time and finding ourselves not being able to complete the private side of the development. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
This council has asked the Finance Advisory Committee, appropriately titled FAC, to wrestle with a couple of these items. If you recall, we asked the Finance Advisory Committee to study the streets and fleet proposals that were outlined a couple of weeks ago. And now I hear very clearly that we're asking Finance Advisory Committee to use their expertise to decide this. Are there any further comments from the City Council at this point? If not, I'd like to, for the benefit of our audience, for who may not have downloaded the TIF phase-out material from the website, to read the last paragraph that you prepared, Jason, and that is next steps. There are several interrelated factors that go into the development of a strategy relating to the expiration of our city's 2 TIF districts. Economic development is a fluid and dynamic effort, and a decision in one area can have a ripple effect throughout the local economy. It's not anticipated that an ultimate decision will be made during the September 19th Committee of the Whole, tonight's meeting. This report and subsequent conversation are a first step in a process to developing a strategy that will have a positive impact on the community. And this points out to what you were saying, Kate, the entire community. Council will be asked to deliberate on several key decisions and provide direction to staff on what steps should be taken over the following weeks. Depending on the direction that is provided, the council will need to reconvene, perhaps during another committee of the whole, as early as this next month. Jason, are there any concluding remarks that you might have?
Mayor, I think at this point, I think there's a lot that we've discussed, and there was a lot that was thrown out tonight, and there's a lot of big decisions to be made. I think from staff's perspective, except for the conversations with the FAC here in the near future, clarity on option C and whether to move forward on that is something that is still desired.
I take it there is no further discussion. I'm told that we do have a executive committee meeting, or executive session tonight. So I would ask for a motion to recess into executive session.
So moved.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Mayor, if we
Yes.
could cite the specific exemption and have a roll call vote, please.
Sure. This is an exemption to the normal procedure, Dean.
Our normal procedure would be to cite the specific exemption, this being purchase or lease of real property as provided for in
Oh, I
5
see.
LCS 120/2C5. And if that was what the motion and second were for?
Right. The approval to hold an executive session to discuss the purchase or lease of real property as provided in 5 ILCS 120/2C5. We've had a motion to approve that. We've had a second. Roll call, please.
Yes.
Jacobson?
Yes.
Fanouken?
Yes.
Markwart?
Yes.
Fagan?
Yes.
Noriko?
Yes.
Verbic?
Yes.
Favor?
Yes.
Smith?
Yes.
8 yes.
We will now recess into executive session.